morning, ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Managing Director of the IMF, Honorable Ministers of Finance and Economic Planning of Rwanda, and our host, Honorable Ministers of Finance, State Ministers, Governors, Deputy Governors from the region, distinguished guests. Welcome to this morning's roundtable discussions on building a resilient and inclusive future, supporting Africa's climate agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to invite the Honorable Minister of Finance and Economic Planning for Rwanda for his welcome remarks, and invite also our guest of honor for her introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, and your distinguished delegation, fellow Ministers of Finance and the Central Bank Governors from the East African community, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, and welcome to Rwanda and to this important roundtable meeting with the IMF Managing Director. Madam Kristalina, it is a great honor and privilege to have you here this morning to discuss with Ministers of Finance and the Governors of Central Banks of the EAC on global challenges affecting our economies, namely the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the war in Ukraine. At the round table, we have guests from the region. We have the Deputy Governor of the Bank of the Republic of Burundi, Mr. Desire Musharitse. Please raise your hand for recognition. I rank them alphabetically, according to the country name. So Burundi comes first. We have the Governor of Central Bank of Kenya, Dr. Patrick Njoroge. We have the Permanent Secretary of the National Treasury of Kenya, Dr. Chris Kipto. We have the Minister of State for Finance, Planning and Economic Development of Uganda, Honorable Amos Lugolobi. We have the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of the Bank of the Uganda, Dr. Michael Atingi Ego. We have the Undersecretary for Planning in the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning of South Sudan, Honorable Okum Jens Carlos. We have also participants from Rwanda. We have the Minister of State in charge of Economic Planning, Dr. Claudine Uwera. We have the Governor of National Bank of Rwanda, Mr. John Rwangombwa. We have the Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Rwanda, Mrs. Soraya Hakuziaremye. And we have the Special Economic Advisor to the President of Rwanda, Mr. Francis Gatare. Sorry. Oh, I forgot the most important person in charge of Treasury. We have my colleague, Minister of State in charge of National Treasury, Mr. Richard Tusabe. He's feeding us all. Thank you. Managing Director, distinguished guests, our economies were heavily affected by COVID-19 in 2020 and continue to struggle with its consequences. The war in Ukraine has worsened the situation, causing unprecedented high inflation levels. These two shocks exposed many weaknesses in our economies, mainly weak health systems and high dependence on import of essential goods from overseas. Since 2021, Our economies in the region have been recovering relatively well. However, we need to build resilience to future pandemics and other shocks. Climate change is another global threat and more complex to address, which affects the global economy, particularly developing economies, including our region. It requires global commitment, global fight, and global cooperation, but it starts from our own national commitment. I take this opportunity to thank you, Madam Kristalina, for your tireless fight in all international fora during COVID-19 for the support to low and middle-income countries, most of them being in Africa. I thank you also for the initiative of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, RST, and all efforts to mobilize its resources for the benefit of our countries. I thank you particularly on behalf of the government of Rwanda for Rwanda's access to RST. We look forward to more African countries accessing RST, including East African Community countries, and to working with the IMF on options to leverage RST to mobilize sufficient resources for climate adaptation and mitigation to ensure our economic resilience and prosperity. Without taking too much time, in our next two sessions, we will discuss in details on the operationalization of RST and how to leverage RST to mobilize more resources to finance our climate agenda. I therefore invite you, Madam MD, to make your introductory remarks. I thank you.
Here. No. It was hidden under my papers. Good morning, and my deepest gratitude to you, Honorable Minister Uziel, to Rwanda for hosting us today, and also to the ministers and governors, members of their delegations, for traveling to Rwanda so we can have a engaged and productive discussion today on the new instrument the IMF has delivered to the membership. What I would like to do in my opening remarks is first to place our meeting today in a global context. What is happening with the world economy? Second, to look at the significance we attach to climate action in the context of preserving macroeconomic and financial stability and promoting growth and employment. And third, to give a very short summary of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, why we created it, what is it, and how it works. Let me start with the global context. As the Minister rightly pointed out, we have experienced unthinkable events over the last years. COVID-19 brought our economies to a standstill and put at risk progress in development in some countries, led to reversing this progress. And then a war in Europe, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has pushed up commodity prices, especially oil, gas, food, leading to an accelerated inflation and pressing central banks to take decisive action to bring it down. We also have to recognize that in the last year, 2022, for the first time, we have experienced climate shocks on all continents, with rather dramatic consequences, including on food security. So the main conclusion we draw from these developments at the IMF is very straightforward. we are in a more shock-prone world, and the combination of health risks, climate risks, and the traditional financial stability risks requires from us to take a comprehensive approach to building resilience to these risks so we can provide for the growth and jobs people aspire for. At the IMF, we are working on a more clear definition of what does resilience mean, and this is work in progress, but I would give you a basic framework that we can rely on as we move to talk about specifically resilience to climate shocks. When the global financial crisis hit, it was an indicator that the banking sector globally was under-regulated, and as a result, it caused dramatic consequences for the world economy. What was the action taken? Stepping forward to put the banking sector everywhere on a sounder footing. In other words, building resilience in the financial sector, specifically in the banking sector. We have to admit that we have not quite yet done entirely the job of resilience in the financial sector because the non-banking financial institutions are still left outside of this more prudent regulatory approach. And we see the consequences of it, for example, when cryptocurrencies, or so-called cryptocurrencies, crypto assets is the appropriate word, have been shaken up. So the reason I start from this is because at the IMF, globally, a very important conclusion was drawn that financial sector resilience matters for the performance of the world economy and the performance of national economies. But similarly, resilience of people matters, and this is the lesson we learned from COVID. For people to withstand a health shock, they need to rely on a strong health system. We also know that education matters, social protection matters, and this lesson from COVID at the fund we integrate by paying even more attention to social spending, the quality of social spending and the impact of social spending. We are now looking at the resilience of societies, recognizing that an issue like inequality affects resilience of communities and societies. If it goes in the wrong direction, it can undermine the foundation for growth by simply getting the social fabric to be harmed. And we see today in, unfortunately, far too many places where people are simply on the street. We are just in the beginning of the year 2023, and you look at Latin America, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, countries where the sense of unfairness in society is putting people against each other and creating negative impact for their economies. But we also have to think about the resilience of our planet. And this is becoming a more important issue by the day. I will tell you a small anecdote from this morning. A young Rwandan woman asked me, can climate change be stopped? And I had to be honest with her and say, unfortunately, no, the genie is out of the bottle. But what we can do is we can decelerate the change in our climate, stabilize it over time, and we can adapt to the consequences of climate change. Why do we care at the IMF about the impact of climate shocks and the opportunities the transition to low-carbon, climate-resilient economy presents? Because they're macro-critical. A country like Dominica gets hit by a devastating storm, the consequences, 200% of GDP wiped out. And you see it virtually everywhere in Africa where droughts, floods, storms are causing loss of productivity, loss of agricultural produce, harming people and communities. But there is a bright side of this story. Investing in the green transition is a very prosperous direction. Why? Because it creates new kinds of jobs, higher quality jobs. If you look at the renewables in comparison to coal, cleaner and technologically more advanced activities. So getting that benefit in developing countries is as important as it is to manage the risks. At the IMF, we have adopted, with the blessing of our membership, a climate strategy for the IMF, and it is about exactly that, how we address climate issues as part of our core mandate of macroeconomic financial stability, growth, and employment. And it has led to 4 very important changes in the way we work. First, in our Article 4 consultations, we now aim to include climate vulnerabilities and climate opportunities, and we already are doing so, especially in countries that are high carbon emitters. But we are also doing it in countries that are vulnerable, most vulnerable to climate risks. Second, in a product that is well known to the world called Financial Sector Assessment, the famous FSAPs, we now include screening from climate-related financial stability risks. For example, is your financial sector too exposed to investing in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate shocks? So you build a building and it gets washed out and the investment is gone with consequences for financial stability. So we are actively looking also into how directing investments to low carbon climate resilient activities can provide more diversification to portfolios in countries. 3, we are an institution that is very important globally in providing relevant data to decision makers. So in our data work now, we have included climate-related data. Our goal is that as a Minister of Finance, you can get your brief on Rwanda, and it would have all the traditional indicators like inflation, balance of payments, employment, GDP per capita, but it also would have your carbon emission intensity, and it would have, and this is the toughest one to produce, a indicator of vulnerability to climate shock. So you can think of the economy in this more comprehensive manner. Last but definitely not least, we are a financial institution, and therefore if we believe that building resilience and investing in sustainability matters, we ought to make it possible for us to support you financially. And this is how the idea of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust was born. It is an innovation. So why we decided to have it? Because we believe that developing countries deserve to have access to long-term financing to underpin their structural transformation. The investment in climate resilience and low carbon development brings benefits over time, and therefore we have to be able to provide longer-term financing. So what is the RST? It is an instrument that has three innovations, three things that we are very proud of. The first one is how we fund it. Last year, as you all know, we have provided special drawing rights to all our members. We provided a record high allocation, $650 billion equivalent. The previous one, the previous largest was during the global financial crisis, 250 billion, just to give you a sense of order of magnitude. But when we provide allocation of SDRs, this is done on the basis of quotas. And we know that advanced economies have large quotas, and developing economies have small, relatively speaking, quotas. So we give SDRs to countries that don't need it, and then we thought, wouldn't it be fair if we ask these countries that don't need the SDRs for their own reserves to own lend through the fund to you, to the developing countries, at highly concessional terms, some of these SDRs. So that was the first innovation, make use of an asset that otherwise would be dormant. And the way I usually talk about it is I point to the SDRs provided to countries in strong reserve positions like a sleeping beauty. So you have that, you know the story of the sleeping beauty. What was the most important thing in the life of the sleeping beauty? The prince came, kissed her, and then she woke up. So we turned to our advanced economy members and we appealed to them. And actually the first country to step forward was France. And France continues to be a leader in this area. So we can make use of something that otherwise would have been dormant. Second innovation, never before the fund would lend at long-term concessional conditions. The RST is 20 years, 10.5 years grace period, and highly concessional terms. We basically follow the SDR interest rate. Now it is slightly higher because interests have gone up, but even so, it is much lower than anything else that is available to many countries on the market. The third innovation is that we recognize we have to make it highly impactful by concentrating on policies that can create good conditions for massive increase in private investments in climate resilience and low carbon development. In other words, while not every RST would be about it, we would like to see using the RST as a catalyst for massive increase in private investments. In other words, we want to count our success on the basis of not only how much we finance, but how much we have generated as private financing. Why is this important? And I want to make this point as strongly as I can. It is important because we are so behind that only a massive acceleration of investment in developing countries would save us. Just to give you the numbers. This decade, by the end of 2030, we have to reduce emissions between 25 and 50% vis-a-vis where they were in 2019. When we take all the pledges that we have made, if we implement all these pledges, we would only reduce emissions by 11%. In other words, our dream of keeping temperatures to go up no more than 1.5, maximum 2 degrees Celsius, this dream would be gone unless we act decisively and unless we act now with focus on emerging markets and developing economies. Why? Because it is there where growth leads to increase in emissions. And I tell my friends from the advanced economies very simply, in Europe is very ambitious, and rightly so. They can bring emissions down to 0. But if Asia, Africa, Latin America continue to increase emissions, it doesn't matter what Europe is to achieve. So we want to see us being a catalyst for moving financing to emerging markets and developing economies. And I want to finish by saying, for us it is extremely important that Africa is front and center in this work. For a very simple reason: fairness. Africa has contributed very little to the problem. Unless it is helped, it will contribute more and more and more. But Africa is already suffering the consequences of climate change in a very dramatic way. So let me finish by saying how proud we are that in our first 4 pilot countries, we have an African country, Rwanda. We also have Barbados, Costa Rica, Bangladesh. We want to see, as we go through the years, my colleague here, Abe, to be in the boardroom with Mr. Sila, our executive director, and all other executive directors, bringing African programs one after another. To succeed, to move, we need you. So I'm going to finish with a very simple appeal. Help us to help you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll watch a video now.
We have turned what was a dream just a year ago into a reality. For the first time, the international community, through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, recognizes vulnerability as a criteria from concessional finance.
This is an extraordinary innovation in the global financial architecture that is what we need in this moment.
The big innovation of the RST actually came with the recognition that when we provided $650 billion SDR allocations to all our members, a significant part went to countries in strong position that actually didn't need it. They put it at the bottom of their reserves, and it became a sleeping beauty. We thought, why not? A kiss that wakes it up. And that is what we actually did. It's a very simple thing, saying in a world where needs are so gigantic and resources are constrained, we should not allow a dormant asset if we can make something out of it. Many countries are saying, okay, if this is successful, we might consider.
we need to get started and get going. If we can demonstrate that this works and works well, then I think it will even invite more partners or maybe to step in and make their contributions.
Rwanda emission represent 0.0003% of world emissions. The emission per capita is 1/12 of the world average, 1/5 of the Africa average. In spite of it, the country decided to put huge amount of the scarce resources to address climate change. It's important to remind it to the rest of the world, because we talk about it in generic terms, but when people put their money where their mouth is, it has to be highlighted.
Every dollar of debt is not equivalent. A dollar of debt to build a school does not give me the same rate of return as quickly as a dollar of debt to build a geothermal facility. We have to ask the economists, with all due respect, to dig a little deeper and to be a little more granular in terms of its metrics. And if we use these crude proxies, then we end up with crude results, which means people fall in between the cracks.
Change the narrative that we can manufacture in developing countries. We don't have to be exporters of raw materials all the time. We're also centers of innovation. Quite frankly, there's so much innovation happening in many of the developing countries that no one hears about because it's not spread. Do not forget, finance is great, but if you don't have the right measures in place trade-wise, it will stop you.
There are very sound propositions. That's what we can do to deal with all these issues. So the main problem is not the technical side of it. It is political will. The conversation has to go on.
The reality is that we need to do more, and we need to do a lot more. If we use the innovation that we see here with the RST, then we can be sweating far more capital out of the multilateral development banks. We should be making the multilateral development banks capable of accessing the SDRs. We should be looking at the creation of a climate mitigation trust that looks to the fact that mitigation doesn't have to take place in small countries or in vulnerable countries. Mitigation has to take place on Earth, on the planet Earth.
For all of us, it is so critical that we help emerging markets and developing countries to transform to low carbon and climate resilient trajectory, or otherwise we are all cooked.
Thank you so much. We'll now invite the MD to open the discussions.
Apologies that you heard twice the Sleeping Beauty story, but it is a beautiful story and it happens to be true. So let's now open up the discussion. It would be very informative if we were to first hear from Rwanda, because Rwanda has built an experience already with the RST and has a story to tell. So if you don't mind, Minister, maybe you can say a couple of words, and then I would take the contributions from around the table.
Thank you, MD. Climate threat is a reality, is affecting our region, our continent, and the world. As Africa contributes little to the global house greenhouse emissions, it is the most affected by the consequences of climate change. It is very important to discuss these issues beyond the environmental context. It is an economic issue, it is a social issue, it is everything. So we congratulate IMF for having really included climate change and climate financing in its core mission. Some people may not understand it unless they participate in such a discussion to understand why is IMF involved in climate change and climate financing. It is because the impact on our economies is huge. For the case of Rwanda, it was projected that if nothing is done, the negative impact of climate change in the next decade could take away about 5 to 7% of GDP. It is the same in many other countries. So it is a serious issue to address today. And unfortunately, the resources required are huge. I will come to this in my second session, but in our nationally determined contributions that was cost at 11 billion Rwandan francs, which is around 8% of GDP for a decade. So it requires multiple interventions and multiple sources of financing. We are happy that we were able to access the RST, and as you rightly said, Madam Kristalina, this is a catalytic fund. We need to be creative. We need to work with IMF and other partners to leverage the RST resources. We have started discussion with some development partners. There are indications that this is possible. So Rwanda is committed to implementing our climate actions. I will give the detail in the next presentation. We have put in place an institutional framework. We have a national green fund, which are trying to mobilize resources and support investors in the green projects. We are starting a new finance facility that was launched at COP27. We are also, with the RST, we are committed to implementing different reforms to ensure mainstreaming of climate in our planning and budgeting and also in a monitoring framework. We want to see also, as my colleagues from the region here, how quick we can access these resources, because they will trigger reforms. They will also serve as a basis to mobilize additional resources to meet our financing needs for climate adaptation and mitigation. So this topic is wide, but I think the most important is to share what we are doing in our respective countries, also to see how we can accelerate the process to access the RST, and we want to hear about the next countries after the pilot phase. Who is next from the continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I take your question is what next, and when we hear from everybody and I address questions raised, of course I will address this question. And now the floor is open for any questions, any comments, any recommendations. countries attending would like to bring forward. I'm looking at the
Thank you.
first speaker.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, we'll take remarks from the Honorable Minister of State for Planning from the Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the MC's assistance to make sure that we follow the order of requests accordingly. So, Honorable Minister.
Thank you so much for the wonderful submission that you have made this morning and for announcing the RST. Indeed, we have been very desperate for this type of financing. As you may know, Uganda is highly dependent on natural resources for its survival. The land, the forests, water, the wetlands, and the wildlife. So all these relate to nature and therefore relate to climate. Agriculture being our main economic activity, 70% actually of the population rely on agriculture. And this agriculture is rain-fed and is probably the biggest contributor to the GDP and economic growth. Tourism, which we also rely on, is actually natural-based tourism. It's reliant on vegetation, the wildlife, and the scenery. And these are probably the leading foreign exchange earners. Now we are investing also in petroleum and the mineral sector. All these have strong connections related to climate change. Now, as a country, we continue to suffer very severe impacts because of these. And these have escalated sometimes the state of poverty. And there's a strong relationship between poverty and environmental degradation. And as a result, we see the depletion of forests. Now, the issue of mitigation or the restoration of our natural resources therefore becomes very central. As government, we still own large parcels of land, but which have been terribly degraded in terms of tree cover. And this is not to mention the degradation happening in the privately owned parcels of land. So there are a number of areas, but I seriously think that the issue of restoration of the forest cover, of the wetlands, becoming very critical. Because by doing so, you'd actually be restoring what we have lost in terms of the water levels, in terms of quality of land, in terms of reducing the emissions, and in terms of the products coming out of the wetlands and the wildlife at the same time. So I want to submit that your pronouncement is very timely. The key question, however, is how do we minimize the lengthy procedures of accessing this fund? I would be very glad to hear from you whether there are more innovative steps in accessing this fund, because the need is desperately there. We needed this yesterday. We have all these other funds like the Global Climate Fund, but very complicated to access. Again, you find that many of us in Africa actually not easily accessing this fund, because of capacity gaps that we continue to have and the high standard of requirements before you are able to access this fund. So I'd love to hear more about the procedures, the conditions attached, you know, and whether these would be quite flexible for us to access this fund. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that others around the table have the same questions. Thank you for formulating them. So clearly, how to access, what are the procedures, how we can make sure we tap into this fund faster. Then next is I'm sorry, I cannot see from here names.
Okay, thank you. I'm Chris Kipto, and the Permanent Secretary from the National Treasury, Kenya. I bring greetings from my Cabinet Secretary, Professor Juguna Ndungu, who is on another assignment elsewhere, and he would have really liked to be here today. But just to say that that was a great presentation, and I happen to have been the immediate Permanent Secretary for Environment and Forest for Kenya. And I was in Glasgow and also in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so clearly, when we talk about climate change, it is not something of a distant future. It's something we see now, we feel now. And from our own country, Kenya, we are actually going through the worst drought in the last 40 years. We have lost over 4 million, livestock, and several animals in our wildlife parks, and we spend, just like most other countries, about 3% of our GDP to respond to impacts of climate change. And whereas we contribute very little to the emissions. I think for us, I heard someone say 0.000 something. And I think we are in that category. But the whole of Africa is 4%. But this Africa is the one that bears the greatest impact. So we have to focus more around adaptation, building the resilience. And so all the 53 African countries I'm aware have already submitted the updated nationally determined contributions. And when I look at most of them, there is a pledge by most countries to spend 10% of their resources, their public resources, to implement the NDCs. The remaining 90% is supposed to come from international sources. There is a challenge, given that most countries are struggling, given the debt levels they have. So there is no fiscal space to even provide additional support to implement those NDCs. For Kenya, for the next 10 years, between 2020 and 2030, to implement our NDC, that is for mitigation and adaptation, we require $62 billion. For mitigation alone is 18 billion, adaptation 44 billion. So you talk about $63 billion, and we have committed 13% of that. And we are struggling, I was just at the National Treasury seeing how much, because we are looking at the landscape of climate finance and how much we are supporting. We are really struggling. And we are pushing to see how we can unlock climate finance. And I think I share with the person who spoke, I think the minister from Kigali, to say that the first problem we need to deal with is the complexity and the rigorous climate finance access requirements and procedures. We have, it's available, yes, but it's difficult to access. So it means there is an issue of capacity. And then there is also a disparity even in what we get as financial flows to climate change. More of it is coming from mitigation rather than adaptation. And with this, we need more money on adaptation. So I think a lot of debate around that. Then we see also a growing replacement of traditional ODA with what is coming now as climate finance, when we should be seeing this more as an additionality, that we should continue with ODA, then now additional climate change. Then a lot of countries also don't have bankable projects. I mean, you want to apply, but there is no capacity, and I think this is an area we need to focus on. So I can only summarize this way, that climate finance needs to be new, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be scalable, and it should be predictable to fund the climate action. But it also needs to be on fair terms, which is why I welcome the new instrument that IMF has, because at least it is recognizing the fact that countries such as those in LDCs and also even developing countries that suffer, like Kenya, that is vulnerable to climate shocks, we could still have another opportunity to access. So we need a conversation around this, because it's going to be really a permanent feature addressing climate change. And I think, let me stop here for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it was very clear from the way you spoke that you have been deeply engaged in these discussions. Thank you for formulating clear questions how we go about financing adaptation, which for Africa is top priority, and how we go about the predictability of this financing. So I'll come to these questions. Why don't we just go around the table following the flow of speakers. Yes.
Oh. Thank you very much, MD, Honorable Ministers. My name is Ochum Bienes Carlo. I'm the Undersecretary for Ministry of Finance and Planning in the Republic of South Sudan. I'm filling the position of my minister who is on duty in Dakar. Like any other countries, South Sudan is an agricultural country, and maybe you have heard for the last 4 years we have been hit by flood, which is exactly opposite our colleagues in Kenya. Drought and flooding are almost the same, very disastrous, and they affect the economies negatively. You see, apparently, many of our people have been displaced from those areas which are flooded for the last 4 years. And agriculture has failed. Even our oil, which we depend on entirely, many oil fields are underwater, so we cannot now produce the oil. And this has affected our economy negatively. The other issue now, way forward, the country, what the government has done is to form what we call NDC, that is National Determined Contribution, to address these issues. Of this, we actually made estimates is at least ranging from $700 to about $1 billion over a number of years to address these issues. So I don't want to tell more. I want to cut the story short. We are trying to do mitigating processes. Of this, the government, of course, of South Sudan is created an emergency situation, but of course, all these require additional resources. We also plan to build artificial lakes to drain the water from the mainstream to far distant areas, but also all these require additional resources. The resources, as I mentioned earlier, are very huge. So with these few comments, I want to welcome this new facility, and that South Sudan actually should qualify for some of these resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and to you, to everybody here, my deepest sympathy for what countries are going through, and what it means to the economy, and above all, what it means to communities and to people. And this is why our discussion is so important, that we can put in place one instrument that, in its modest way, that's not a silver bullet, but its modest way is really impactful to help countries in a rapid and effective manner.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Managing Director, for the very informative presentation, and I would like to thank the IMF for this timely Resilience Sustainability Trust, which is really going to address the challenges a number of developing countries are facing as far as climate change is related. I want to agree with my previous speakers, the former speakers. I think they raised some strategic issues regarding the whole aspect of climate change. But I just want to deviate a bit and become a bit more operational. Madam Managing Director, you raised the issue of macro criticality of the climate change. So I wanted to find out from you, in terms of the immediate needs, we need to begin incorporating the effects of climate change in our frameworks that we use for monetary policy, financial stability assessment, and you also acknowledge the fact that there are still capacity constraints, both at the fund and more so at the country levels. So can I then find out how do we ensure that the macro criticality of this climate change is incorporated in the immediate terms? Because changes in weather are with us. They're affecting inflation, they're affecting financial sector stability, and then there's the whole aspect of data requirements in order to come up with these operational frameworks. Because you can have a framework, but in the absence of data, how do you really operationalize it? So that is the starting point from the operational perspective. Now, I want to get into the RST itself. I think the RST is a well-designed tool to address our sustainable needs in as far as the changes in climate is concerned. But I wanted to find out from you, the institutional frameworks that are required to operationalize these RST, is there a minimum that you're looking at? Because countries have at various levels of institutional development for this. Do you need to acquire a minimum standard of institutional frameworks, or you can just go stage by stage? For example, I know that in the case of Rwanda, they had to come with a comprehensive institutional framework. Now, some countries have not yet gotten in there. They're taking it stage by stage. So taking the case of Uganda, at the central bank level, we've come up with a climate change policy. How do we operationalize climate changes in our operational frameworks? And also now we're pursuing what we call environmental, social, and governance standards as a first step towards addressing this. But this is only limited in the financial sector. So is it possible to get some form of capacity development in that area, some form of financing to address the thing going forward? And then also I note that the need for a comprehensive climate diagnostic analysis is very important before accessing the RST. Now, what does it take to get the comprehensive climate diagnostic? Do you need to be at a certain stage, or you can start with what you have at the moment, and then you build on that to identify the key areas that you want to address? And if that's possible, how do you access that? Then my final question to you is, climate is a cross-border phenomenon. So whereas we appreciate the national efforts to address climate, it's only helpful in as far as immediate needs are concerned. So take, for example, if you want to promote irrigation, you need to secure the water catchment area. You need to green the country. But over time, I think the cross-border phenomenon becomes important. So how do you address the cross-border aspects of this? So take, for example, Rwanda has made progress. God forbid that Uganda, Tanzania, and the neighboring countries don't make progress. How sustainable are the efforts of Rwanda? I thank you.
Excellent questions. Thank you. How we build these diagnostics, what is the role of capacity development? Can we move beyond country by country to sub-regional, regional approaches to increase the impact? Thank you. And next, our next speaker.
Thank you, Managing Director. My name is Desire Musharitse. I'm Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Burundi. I invite you to use the interpretation. I will speak in French. Merci encore une fois, Madame le Directeur Général. Merci encore une fois pour l'initiative que le Fonds monétaire a mise en œuvre pour atténuer les changements climatiques, surtout pour nos régions, surtout l'Afrique. Ma question, c'est par rapport aux pays fragiles, comme le Burundi, où il y a une combinaison de tous ces chocs, les chocs externes dus au Covid.
Monsieur le gouverneur, si vous pouvez attendre un peu pour qu'elle fixe les... Oh.
Donc, par rapport à nos pays fragiles, surtout le Burundi, on fait face à une combinaison de chocs externes, notamment le choc du Covid, le choc de la guerre en Ukraine, le choc climatique. Et là, c'est un problème pour nos pays pour trouver des espaces budgétaires pour pouvoir financer les projets en faveur du changement climatique. Et là également, on a des problèmes liés aux capacités. Comment justement aider nos pays à avoir accès à cette fenêtre de financement climatique. Le problème qu'on fait face, justement, c'est que on a beaucoup de besoins au niveau social et il devient difficile de dégager une marge de manœuvre pour financer justement les projets en faveur du climat. Également, il y a une question qui a été posée par mon collègue, je crois, de l'Ouganda. Est-ce que ça ne serait pas bon d'avoir une approche régionale? Parce que s'il y a une sécheresse en Tanzanie, ça affecte directement le Burundi. On l'a vu avec l'année 2022, avec les changements climatiques. On a eu des problèmes au niveau de l'alimentation de la population. Et je dois vous informer que nous avons une inflation, un pic d'inflation le plus important par rapport à toute la région. On est à 26,7. Et c'est dû justement à une inflation purement alimentaire. Et là, on n'a pas de marge de manœuvre. S'il y avait le voisin, la Tanzanie ou l'Ouganda qui avait plus, on aurait pu importer là-bas. Et là, on a des problèmes. C'est là où je dis, pour nos pays, pour nos pays fragiles, c'est vraiment, je vois qu'il sera très difficile d'avoir accès à ce guichet, parce que il y a un problème de capacité, mais également de voir comment subvenir à d'autres besoins importants pour nos pays. Je vous remercie.
This is so very, very true. Again, I will come to this question as to how we best integrate what we do on the side of climate with our objectives for poverty reduction and improvements in quality of life. This is our final speaker to finish this tour de table, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you very much, Managing Director and colleagues around the table. Just want to add on to the comments that our head of delegation, PS, just now put at the table, and of course, associating myself with the comments from other delegations. Really, the issue of climate change is now everybody, 99.999% of the population understand that this is real. But from our perspective as policymakers and everybody who is involved in this space, the financing needs are huge, they are long-term, and they are huge societal returns. So this is in contrast to limited or small private returns. So these three issues are somewhat problematic, and I think the comments that were made by the earlier speakers can relate to these three angles, as it were. So
taking them in turn, but without repeating what others have said. The first one in terms of resources, I think the issue here, we are obviously very pleased with the RST, but I think the issue here is very quickly the catalyzing the resources. And you mentioned that in your presentation. What is the catalytic impact of this bailing in other resources? And I think Rwanda is an excellent pilot case. And to this, we do appreciate the courage of our brothers in Rwanda, minister, governor, etc., that have taken this step. Because Rwanda, in a sense, will be a test case of the bailing in of other financiers, as it were. And if that works, then it will work for most of us. If it doesn't work, you can be sure it won't work for any of us. So I think that, to me, is the first thing. Now, I say this with a bit of humility because generally it's the other way. You know, myself and my brother, the governor, we compete on innovation. And when Kenya goes ahead, you can be sure Rwanda will come back 6 months later with a better product. So it's, but in this case, I think it's clear that is something that has to be dealt with. Secondly, the issue of this is long term. There are points that were raised, but I would stress that therefore there will be other issues that will be germane in the 20 years that will come in. So the relationship with the other functions, let's say the standard, let's say shocks that will be coming, and we talked about access, but one could also say what is are there limits? Do you add this to that? In typical fund doctrine. So I think we need to understand that better because that's where the rubber meets the road. If indeed after Rwanda has borrowed, 100% of quota, and then there's another shock on something else, how will the country deal with that? And I think that is extremely important. Because it goes back to this thing is we are not substituting. We are actually adding. There should be addition, not a sense of substitution. But at the same time, we also have another long-term item. Maybe this is not so germane in Europe. So it hasn't come up in the advanced economy context of climate change. But from our perspective here in Africa, there is another long-term issue which relates to the youth and the demographic dividend that we expect. So we do need financing for that. We need to change the economy or transform our economies to really deliver on that. And if we believe the United Nations, they have a number like 25% of the world's labor force will be in Africa. I think it is 2050. In 25 years from now. So the point is we need to be dealing with these two together, and it's not one or the other. And if we ignore one or do one kind of muddling along and not get the actual outcomes, I think it will be a disaster for the world, not just for Africa. Finally, this thing of societal returns. The question that I have is, it's true we talk about bailing in the private sector, the financiers, etc. But in the climate change discussion, and indeed in all that we have done here, it seems to me we are not bailing in the population. So the population are sort of separate. We as policymakers and ministers and the fund and the World Bank, and we are having our conversation, but we have forgotten the population. Somehow, if the population is not part of this bailing in or they are bailed in this program, I think it's doomed to fail. So those are my 3 points, but I think I would also encourage you to to get another, let's say, story. And this is the one about marathons. And I think the one here is that we have to do it. If you want to go far, you need to go together. That's the marathon story. Thank you.
So very true. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you, MD. I want just to add just 2 points. Following what my colleagues have raised, I want to raise 2 issues. One is about the allocation of RST resources. For Africa, except probably Nigeria, DRC, and South Africa, all other countries have very small size of quotas. So the allocation of resources based on quotas is a problem. Many countries with huge financing needs, but with small quotas, we receive less support when they qualify. So one of the issues to consider is to see how to ensure that despite small size quotas, this country can receive sufficient resources to address climate issues. Number 2 is the readiness of countries. I believe many African countries are willing to, they need money, they are willing to access RST, but now issue of readiness. Is there any possibility to probably to use a small portion of the resources to accompany countries to get ready for the full RST? Kind of transition. If this is possible, then it could help really, maybe in 6 months or 1 year, country can get ready to access fully the RST. I thank you.
Thank you for all these comments and excellent questions. I will try to respond in details as much as possible, and of course, some of these questions, they will inform our work following up the meeting we have today. So let me start with the most pressing, and it is the question, how do we access the funds? What are the procedures? What are the conditions? The RST is designed to be accessed in combination with a fund program that could be financing or non-financial program. Why, in the end, we decided that it is important to link the RST to a fund program? Because the objective of the fund program is to ensure macroeconomic and financial stability, and that prudent policies are in place overall. And that would mean that the climate policies we would support are well grounded in sound macroeconomic performance. This is very important for our members, especially for the members that are providing SDR resources to us on land. That confidence that we are lending into a sound macroeconomic framework. I want to stress that non-financing programs, in other words, having a discussion policy, ongoing policy discussion with the fund, also counts. It doesn't have to be a UCT program that the RST complements. And in fact, in the case of Rwanda, that is exactly where we are. We have a policy instrument, and we are anchoring the RST in this policy instrument. In terms of procedures, the country obviously has to express interest, and then we have to have some work done that identifies what are the policies, the climate policies that the RST can support. Doesn't have to be done by the fund. And some of you asked this question, where is the policy anchor coming from? We partner directly and immediately with the World Bank, and that was the case of Rwanda. The World Bank, working with Rwanda, has completed a comprehensive climate and development assessment, and out of it we draw policies that can be enhanced with the support of the RST. We partner with other organizations. In fact, Abe is going to be in contact with the Global Center for Adaptation. Because for Africa, as many of you said, adaptation is the top priority. We partner with the African Development Bank that has taken a very decisive turn towards supporting adaptation as priority, and adaptation investments exceed mitigation investments. We partner with the business community. For example, right now in Rwanda, we have IFC and some of the private sources of finance in discussion with our deputy managing director, led by our deputy managing director, Bo Lee, that are around how we can trigger more climate finance using the RST as a lever. Bear with us. This is new for the fund. And this is why we move forward carefully. Also, bear with us. At this point of time, the RST is well-resourced, but it is not infinite. I mean, there is finite resource of $40 billion. And we want to make sure that there is fair treatment of the membership as we get countries to access the RST. We are very quick. We were very quick to establish the RST. We promised our members we would do it within a year, from the idea to operationalizing the RST, exactly 1 year. We delivered on that. And why? Because speed is of the essence. We have no time to waste. Similarly, different from many of the other organizations you deal with, accessing the RST is straightforward. You make your request. It is associated with the program that ensures macroeconomic and financial fundamentals are sound. Our team works on what can we enhance with the RST, and then disbursements are fairly, as the fund always does, there are conditions to be met, and then disbursements are very rapid. Another question that came was, but don't do that at the expense of other priorities. And I want to be very clear, the RST is an additional instrument to what the IMF is doing. In other words, we are not taking money away from, say, from the PRGT, from the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, to move it to the RST. We have, broadly speaking, 3 groups of instruments. We have the emergency financing, so if Kenya or any other country is hit by unexpected severe shock, the country is eligible to apply and receive emergency financing. And as you know, we use the emergency financing instrument very actively to respond to the COVID shock. We have the second are the upper credit tranche programs. They can be structured in a different way, but what is common is that they look at what are the shortcomings in the macro policy framework that ought to be addressed. And then we have non-financing instruments that are about policy engagement with countries that do not need financial support from the fund, but benefit from the engagement with our teams. Quite a number of you brought up the question of capacity development. And I can assure you that our capacity development teams take this as a priority, and we are actually seeking and receiving additional support from our better off members so we can provide this capacity, skills enhancement. We went to our board, we asked for additional budget so we can hire experts that can make the RST and more broadly the work of the fund on climate and macro impact more resourced. We got a blessing from the fund, from the board, I must say. We wanted some more. We got what we got. We are making the best out of it. And we also have our traditional engagement. Don't forget, our Article 4, this is the space to think about climate in the context of all development challenges a country faces, and then see how we can integrate effectively policies that support macroeconomic financial stability, growth, employment, as well as climate adaptation, more shift to lower carbon development. I want to explicitly address the issue of combination of funds. At the IMF, we take very seriously our responsibility to work with all who play a role rather than work on our own. We are currently designing a protocol of engagement, and a big chunk of that protocol is when we engage with the country, how do we make sure that we tap into the work of other organizations and that we are complementary rather than competing or substituting what others do. What is the strength of the fund? Macro policy. Think of fiscal policy, think of monetary policy. This is where the fund usually comes with the best in class, best skills. We are not a project finance institution. We are not the World Bank. We don't have climate engineers. We don't have climate scientists. What we have is macro policy experts that can think through the role of taxation, social spending, monetary policy to help a country be more effective faced with this new challenge. And you are absolutely right. It has become a very obvious, a top priority. How to determine macro criticality? Well, this is what we work on, and we now have a very sound research agenda. We have macro models that include climate variables. So we can look at, for example, the link between frequent climate shocks and inflation. I mean, obviously, if you're losing your agricultural output washed out by floods or cut short by droughts, that puts pressure on prices. So how we go about thinking in that way of securing macro stability. A very important question that you put forward is regional approach. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense to go sub-regional, regional. We cannot lend to sub-regions, but we can coordinate programs so they make sense because they complement each other and they strengthen the impact of these programs as a result. Again, I want to repeat, this is new for us. We just started. So please bear with us as we build our own understanding and our own capabilities. I want to finish with the issue of quotas. Indeed, countries with tiny quotas have the same limitation, maximum 150% of quotas, or maximum 1 billion, whichever comes first. None of the countries in this room would have 1 billion coming first. I agree with you that we have to advocate for higher access in relative terms, relative to quota, for smaller countries and for poorer countries where the quota is just tiny. We are not there yet. We can only bring this forward once we have demonstrated that the RST works and we have secured possibly even higher contribution from members. France announced they initially committed 20% of their new SDRs to on-land. They announced that they will go up to 30%. I am encouraging others to follow suit. If we are successful and we get more funding, then we can discuss the issue of limits. But for now, we need to work with the parameters we have. Finally, I want to recognize the importance of talking with people. They are the beneficiaries. The IMF learned this the hard way. If you only talk to those in the corridors of power and don't take into account the impact of policies on people, we may not do the right thing. So we do take very much to heart what is the impact of different segments of the population and how we can make sure that these policies serve people, especially the most vulnerable part. And with this, I would turn, my apologies, we taken a bit of the second session. I apologize for that. But I thought that it was important that I provide you as much as possible, as comprehensive as possible answers to your questions. Thank you. Thank you. And now I pass the floor to you, Minister, for the second session of our today's engagement.
Thank you, MD. I want to recognize the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of South Sudan, Dr. Adis Otowo. Welcome, sir. So we have coffee, tea, so there's no break, but we are free to stand up and pick anything you need. We're now moving to the second session, which is dedicated to climate finance and the resource mobilization. So as we move to this session, we'll be discussing the current challenges linked to the access to concessional climate finance, the catalyzer role of the IMF's RST with other financing available, and more globally, the position of IMF beyond financial assistance. The cost of adaptation in sub-Saharan Africa alone will be between $30 billion and $50 billion per year in the next decade. It's a huge amount given other pressing needs. This will drive governments to further borrow to mitigate climate impacts and to adapt. And given the weak sovereign credit ratings for most of our countries, and therefore higher cost of borrowing, this means that our countries will be more likely to accumulate unsustainable debt when faced by climate shocks. This can lead to a vicious cycle between debt distress and climate risks, where the effects of climate change gradually drive up the cost of countries to build climate resilience. And this is a serious problem. As an example, the cost of implementing Rwanda's NDC, Climate Action Plan, is around 11 billion. But this is since 2015. Currently, the gap is around 6.5 billion. Despite all efforts, this is a huge task. So we need to be creative and based on starting from RST to find other mechanisms to mobilize additional resources. In Rwanda, we tried to work through various milestones. One, commitment to a development agenda aligned to mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And this is well highlighted in our national development agenda, which incorporates climate-related targets in our Vision 2050 and our medium-term national strategy for transformation. And moreover, we ensure climate-related issues are mainstreamed into sectors and districts at subnational level, both in plans and strategies for implementation. We have mechanisms to monitor progress on quarterly and annual basis. The national agenda is aligned to regional and global commitments, such as the Paris Agreement and others. We have established legal framework that guide in implementation of our climate agenda, and you have mechanisms to monitor progress. We have key leading institutions such as the Ministry of Environment, the Rwanda Environment Management Agency, and our National Green Fund for NERWA. These initial steps with support from our development partners have allowed to attract some resources, but it is not enough yet. The National Green Fund for NERWA has mobilized domestic financing to fund 45 climate-related projects in 2022 to facilitate project implementation to international financial institutions. Rwanda's Ministry of Environment is accredited to Green Climate Fund, and the Adaptation Fund and is supporting commercial banks to be similarly accredited in order to access funds. I can mention also the engagement by development partners, which has been strong. We have several development partners who are financially supporting and or providing technical assistance for projects in the following areas: agriculture, biodiversity, and forestry. These are European Union, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, UK, UNEP, UN, FAO, World Bank, and many others. In the sector of renewable energy, we have European Union, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, US, African Development Bank, Global Green Growth Institute, UNDP, UNEP, and the World Bank. In water and sanitation, we have also a cluster of Germany, Japan, Netherlands, and AFDB. So we have a kind of division of labor in these key sectors, and we're lucky that our development partners have joined these clusters to support our climate initiatives. Some development partners are involved in urban development, such as Belgium, Germany, and the World Bank, and in land management, such as the UK, and waste management, mainly Sweden. So we really have identified key areas and have pooled our development partners with expertise, with resources to support us in those sectors. Development partners have also provided technical assistance to implement our sustainable finance roadmap by the Kigali International Financial Center initiative to try to attract funds for investment in the country and from the country to the region. Such development partners include France, Germany, Sweden, African Development Bank, and FCDO, and UNDP. To give you some examples, Germany is now supporting the Green City Kigali project, which intends to develop a sustainable neighborhood, while the Green Climate Fund, GCF, has supported the Green Gicumbi project, which intends to strengthen climate resilience of rural communities. Under the new Resilience Sustainability Trust, Rwanda will access up to 319 million US dollars, equivalent to 240 SDRs, million SDRs, which is a highly concessional financing to advance efforts in building resilience against climate change. We expect that RSF supported reforms will help mobilize additional resources in close collaboration with the IMF and other partners. In terms of private climate finance, during COP27, Rwanda launched the IREME Invest, a new green investment facility that will increase the private sector's contribution to Rwanda's response to climate change. IREME Invest is an initiative of the government through the Rwanda Green Fund, FONERWA, and the Development Bank of Rwanda, with support from a range of development partners. IREME Invest will feature a project preparation facility through grants and a credit facility offering concessional loans and a credit guarantee. As current resources are not near sufficient compared to the needs, we need to mobilize more, both public and private resources through different financing mechanisms, including green bonds, blended finance, and attraction of private funds through the newly established Kigali Financial Center. We are in talks with some partners to support us in this journey. Let me stop here and leave the floor to other members of the roundtable to also make their contribution on this topic. I thank you. We follow the same rule. We do a round. Yes, Kenya, please.
Yeah, so I think I had made a contribution earlier, but just to say that we take matters climate change very seriously. And we host the UNEP, so we consider ourselves an environmental capital. And our Constitution 2010 has articles on need to address matters of environment and climate change. We have a climate change policy in place. We have an adaptation plan to 2030. And out of that adaptation plan, we have action plans every 5 years. We are now working on from 2022 to 2027. We have also a number of policies that have been taken place through the National Treasury, like the climate change finance policy. We are also developing regulations. We have gone ahead to develop a law. We call it Climate Change Act, which is in place. It has a council chaired by the president, and we are in the process of operationalizing it. The law also provides for a climate change fund, which we are in the process of operationalizing. There is a lot in terms of policy, legal, and regulatory framework. And the challenge has been more about financing. And we have worked hard to provide through our own resources and leveraging also on available international finance like GEF, Global Environmental Facility, and also the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, and other bilateral support that we get. We have Germany, UK, and many others that are already supporting us. And the World Bank has supported us also under what we call FLOCA, Financing Locally Climate Change Action at the local level, to the ward. And we are now in the process of working on that. We have 47 counties, sub-regional, sub-national authorities, and we are actually working to ensure that climate change is at units are established at the counties. And for all ministries also, we are setting up climate change units. Every ministry is supposed to have that. So I think there is a lot that we are putting in place. Our NDC is focusing on six sectors, especially on mitigation. We are focusing on energy sector to go for more renewables, and we want to go for 100% renewables by 2028. Looking about issues of efficiency, we are focusing also on our geothermal, because we have a lot of capacity on that. In other words, we want to move away from reliance on fossil fuel. Our other sector is transport sector. So we are looking at reducing the number of years for our vehicles, if we can make them clean. Of course, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of our people need to afford to drive better vehicles. But for SGR, we have a standard gauge rail. We are seeing whether we can move to electricity, we electrify, and also even get new electric vehicles as a way of focusing on mitigation. We have our industry, which is also another sector we are focusing on to make sure they go green. And then agriculture is another sector. Then forestry. The government of Uhuru Kenyatta worked very hard the last 10 years to increase our forest cover. And our cover now has moved from very low. We used to have around 5.9 to 8.7. We're talking about tree cover of about 12%, which is low. This new government has even raised it, the ambition higher. We want to restore in the next 10 years, 10 million hectares to take our forest cover to 30% and grow about 15 billion trees. We are setting up a tree growing fund to see whether we can, and UNDP and the UN is supporting us to set up that fund. I think I can say a lot more. All we are saying is, in fact, last week we discussed with the IMF rep, Tobias, and we are working hard to begin to apply for RTS. We want to compete with Rwanda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who is the next? Burundi? Oh, I saw the flag. Any? Oh, yes.
I recognize that in the first round we got quite comprehensive inputs from participants here. In the second round, we heard the approach taken by Kenya, actually by Rwanda, and I'm sure it is the same in other countries, to pursue the intersection between mitigation and adaptation. And I want to press on how important it is to do more of it. If we have a very active program and policy framework that promotes reforestation, addressing land degradation, that is very good for adaptation, because we know that healthy forests means healthy soils, means lesser risk of droughts and lesser impact of floods, less landslides, less danger for communities. But we also are generating carbon sinks that have direct contribution to bringing carbon emissions down. I'm raising this point because I want to stress that when we think about the RST in Africa, we want it to be really relevant for Africa and to address the policy constraints to more of this happening. There are two questions that we hope over time, by building experience in individual countries, to advance with the international community. The first one is the role of carbon credits. During the last COP, progress was made to recognize that carbon credits are a legitimate source of income for countries that contribute to carbon sequestration. But from here, from this recognition to actually making these predictable flows part of your budgets and your fiscal position, there is a long way to go. And we would like to deploy our fiscal capabilities. I mean, after all, we are an institution with strong fiscal skills to advance this discussion. And hopefully, through the RST, we will also accumulate more practical evidence on how to deal with the two big obstacles for carbon credits to become a predictable long-term source of revenues at a national level, but also for communities. The first one is leakage. You plant trees, but then comes some other political view and the trees are gone. What do we do? What happens with the carbon credits? And the second one is that we do not have sufficient information to properly assess the ecosystem service forests provides or other elements. So we will have to work on those two issues. And I just want to share with you that we think at the fund this is a very important task for us. If we succeed to create predictable long-term stream of revenues from carbon credits that expands your fiscal space to do what is necessary in the country, that would be a huge contribution of our collective work. The second issue is climate and debt. We know that many low-income countries are under a high burden of debt, and we know that part of this debt is being generated because they are severely hit by climate shocks. So how can we create a way in which debt for climate swaps become part of the solution of financing? This is something that our team has initiated work on. And again, as we work on the RST, thinking about the evidence-based approach, how we can resolve a policy question of that nature, that would be extremely helpful for everybody. On the financing side, I heard you in first time and the second time talking about the importance to tap in different sources of financing. I just want to state the obvious. And the obvious is that there is simply not enough public money anywhere to finance the climate transformation. We are talking about trillions that are necessary, and we are discussing the billions that are available. Unless we use the billions to create strong conditions for private investments on the scale that is necessary, we won't achieve, we won't get anywhere. And we have been talking about taxing, you demanding from us, from your organizations, from the international financial institutions, that we bring our collective capacity and then we deploy it together to move money faster. And as we sit in this room, we're still fragmented. And I admit this is the case. World Bank does this, African Development Bank does that, everybody has a project. They're all very good, but they are not moving they're not moving us. There is an old anecdote, and I'll finish with it. Man walking and kicks a bottle, picks it up, a genie comes out. And the genie tells the man, "You saved me from this prison. Whatever wish you have, I will make it come true." The man says, "You know, I live in, for the sake of argument, in Kenya, but my very best friend is in the United States. I hate flying. So can you please, Genie, build a road and a bridge over the ocean so I can drive to visit my friend?" Genie says, "I have never heard anything so idiotic. What a wish is this? Don't you have a better wish?" And the man says, "Well, you know, I work for the World Bank, and we really want to bring all institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and others to work together." Genie says, "So how do you want the bridge? 1 lane or 2 lanes?" Joke on the side, we have a job to do, and at least from us, I can tell you, in the fund, we fully recognize the enormous responsibility for our institutions to work together.
Thank you, MD. In this area of innovative financing, we have there is a capacity gap that we need to fill, and it as was raised in the first session. I think this is the area that, as also you promised, does require much attention, because all the solutions available can be accessed only if the right capacity, the project, bankable projects, and everything is put in place to access. But there is another big question: is that even those resources, when they are accessible, they are very expensive. This is also a discussion that continues to happen in different fora. Given the current levels of debt and the high cost of borrowing, it's become really difficult to access resources. So we need some instruments that the de-risking instruments or guarantees or other mechanism to help the countries to access affordable resources. Number 2 is the ongoing processes to restructure or to cancel some debt for some African countries with high debt burden, but it is very slow. I know IMF has been pushing really for a faster process, but we have so many partners involved, the G20, the Paris Club, and others. So this is a fight to continue to fight. But even if the existing resources may not be accessible because countries are already facing the debt burden, so we needed to see what other mechanisms to lower debt burden, to not to access more resources, or to lower to increase the concessionality of loans so that such country can access sufficient resources. Yes, Uganda.
Thank you so much once again. Just a few more interventions, particularly emphasizing this existing fund, the Global Climate Fund. these other sources of climate financing, which are available and coming through pledges. By 2021, the available financing from developed countries for developing economies was actually more than 632 billion shillings. But we have noted globally, these global meetings, COP, this serious issue of access, especially by developing countries, Africa inclusive. In fact, we are the least beneficiaries from this funding. And we have you as IMF, you are our main, how can I call you, tool that we can use in helping us to access this money. This is money that was plagued, is available, but practically access becomes a problem. In this kind of conversation, how can we really unbundle the challenges that we are facing in accessing this fund so that we can access it? How could we turn this into reality? Moving from pledges to real action. And we have talked about this several times, but it's not happening. What is really bedeviling that movement of resources from this fund to help Africa out of this quagmire? Secondly, you were talking about issues relating to the debt swaps. Even these ones largely remain on paper. We don't come down to unbundle the issues that are involved to secure these debt swaps, where our debts continue to escalate. These solutions are not really becoming readily available to us. But I want to applaud the Rwanda for the initiative on under the National Green Climate Fund, the way you really articulated it. And I want to commend you for the work that you have done in this area, mobilizing on your own resources, including the private sector in your country and the various donors. I really listened with a lot of excitement on what we are doing, and I think it is a very good lesson. Maybe because we are tempted to think that there's a fund out there which would help us, but which is actually not happening or very complicated to access. Maybe the Rwanda model is the way to go, so that we hustle within our little resources that we can easily access, and then we access those, and then move, particularly on the issues of mitigation, the restoration of these trees that we lost over time. I started with that point, and I'm glad that you have emphasized it. And as a region, particularly this East African region, I think we have a huge comparative advantage in restoring tree cover because we have sufficient rains. As long as we have helped the plants to grow in the initial few months, the rest we leave it to God to take care of those trees. So it's a huge comparative advantage. The amount of investment that we need in that one is actually not much. Because we are talking about a regional kind of intervention at individual level. It's something all of us can do within this region so that we enhance tree cover within the region at a very minimum investment. That could be a very useful starting point. I want to end by probing into the issue of the SDR, the redundant SDR that you talked about earlier, available with the developed countries. Is it possible that we can engage into bilateral discussions, if Uganda, for example, finds a developed partner with redundant SDR, could we engage in a bilateral engagement with the facilitation of the IMF in that endeavor? Maybe this could be a much faster approach. I'm just trying to probe into this and find and see if there's a solution to that. Thank you very much.
If there are no other interventions, I'm going to respond to this actually very thoughtful one from Uganda and link it to what we heard from Rwanda on their experience. What we face today is resources to support climate action and more broadly environmental sustainability are fragmented, and conditions to access different funds and resources available are different from one to the other. This is on the one side. On the other side, we have countries that have very often limited institutional capabilities. So the result is, as you said, money is somewhere there, but tapping into this money is a huge problem for countries. Our response to that is twofold. One, we are creating an instrument that is easy to access because it is exactly what we do as an institution, what we have been doing for decades. When the fund steps forward, it is usually fast, and our disbursements go straight into your budget or your reserves instantaneously once the agreed conditions are met. So we are setting up an example that maybe others would look into and say, well, if the IMF does it in this way, maybe we have to find a way to be more faster and more effective. But it is 40 billion. That's not going to resolve the problems we face. So how can we use our role, traditional role as convener, to apply it in this field? I don't want to make pronouncements that we are going to solve it in a day, but I'm giving you our commitment, our institutional commitment, when we engage in a country, to strive to help the country see the whole picture of financing and to move as much as possible money in a coherent manner. We are very fortunate with Rwanda, and I want to go to the Rwandan experience, because Rwanda is really an example of how you can coordinate those who you support you. Put a framework, so they have to go through this framework. Kenya is doing quite a lot of the same. We want to get these examples sort of lifted up and then draw out of them a protocol, standardize how we do it. So it becomes, for everybody who contributes, it becomes a normal requirement to cooperate, to collaborate, to work in a framework of the country, rather than each and every partner on the basis of their own objectives, their own rules. This is a problem that has been with us for a long, long time, meaning that the solution of this problem is not going to be automatic. But I'm convinced that in a world where needs are growing and resources are shrinking, we ought to overcome our institutional boundaries and priorities and align under the leadership and for the countries. Let's remember that over the last years, something that we all cherished, a decline in poverty and a decline in hunger has been reversed. And climate change is going to make this reversal even more profound. I regret to say it, but that is what lies ahead. The war in Ukraine is truly a global phenomenon. Why? Because it affected countries far from where the fighting is, but even more so because it wiped out something that we all enjoyed and relied on, the so-called peace dividend. After the Cold War, everybody felt more confident, military expenditures went down. Now what we see is, for understandable reasons, because of concern about security of citizens, military expenditures are climbing up. But money that is spent here is not going to be spent there. So in this environment of growing needs and shrinking resources, you have to really keep our feet to the fire, to demand from us to demonstrate that we can muster the will to overcome narrow institutional interests and priorities and work for the bigger public good. I want to make a point on the reforestation. Ironically, reforestation would only succeed if simultaneously access to renewable energy also succeeds. Why? Because we know if there is no access to electricity, people would chop the forest. So you plant it with one hand and you chop it with the other. So we will have, and this is why I always tell people in Africa, don't take renewable energy as a secondary objective for Africa. It is a primary objective. So we can actually create the conditions for people to have access to electricity. Of course, there is a whole debate around the role of gas in this transition. I'm going to leave it on the side for today. But to think about moving forward in a way that mitigation helps adaptation and adaptation creates revenues so you can invest more in access to electricity, for example. And I think the conversation here today is about a particular instrument. I honestly think that the fund has exceeded its own ambition, because when we first started, when we said we can do this, there were quite a number of voices saying, no, you can't, or not so fast. So we are proud. We have achieved something for our membership that is good for the membership. But it would only deliver if we think big, if we have the ambition to do more by aiming for the sum of different activities to be bigger than, for the whole to be bigger than the sum of individual parts. Next time when we meet, when we have the Rwanda experience already advanced, when we have other countries tapping into the RST, I would challenge us to discuss, are we bringing that collective effectively, or we're still just having one instrument, good instrument, bravo, but without that mobilization on scale that is necessary. This is the beginning of an engagement from the fund, not the end. You're right to say that the fund has a responsibility because of our macro focus that is bigger than specialized agencies, and we have to live up to your expectations for what we can do. I would say something that our board member knows very well. Initially, there was skepticism. Should the fund be even involved in climate and sustainability? That skepticism is gone. And it is gone not because we are so effective to wipe it out, but because Mother Nature has spoken. and it has been a clear message to us. Get your act together and do the right thing, work for a world that is more resilient, because shocks will continue to come. I wish I could end on something more positive, Minister. Well, maybe the positive thing is, look at us. We can do so many other things today, but we decide to do this. Bring up the competence, the common understanding, and the will to act together. Oh, I'm so sorry. I got carried away. The debt issue. We are in a very difficult place because over the last years, the burden of debt on the shoulders of especially low-income countries has gone up significantly. And today, servicing debt is becoming even more painful because of interest rates going up. In this environment, we have advocated, from the moment COVID hit, we have been advocating for zeroing in on debt and having a good mechanism for debt resolution. What has been achieved? First, the debt service suspension initiative. It pushed debt service beyond the COVID period. Second, at the IMF, we used a very good instrument, Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust, so we can provide grants to our poorest members to not have to pay us during this period of great difficulty. Close to $1 billion of, in a sense, debt relief provided by, through the fund to some 29 countries. Three, the G20 created the common framework for debt resolution. It has so far been approached by 4 countries: Chad, Zambia, Ethiopia, and most recently, Ghana. Only Chad has concluded all the necessary steps for debt reduction. I'm coming from Zambia. There are intense discussions of the creditors committee. We hope that the Zambia situation would be also resolved. Ethiopia and for Ghana, again, we are hopeful that there would be a quick resolution, and Ethiopia is now moving towards more in-depth discussions. We have been arguing that the common framework has to be predictable in terms of timeline. So if you are a country asking for treatment, you need to know what happens by when. So it's not like you're entering this tunnel and you don't see any light in the end. We have been arguing that this predictability should be combined with clear procedures for the work of the Creditors Committee, and that countries that are not low income should have access, like Sri Lanka, to the common framework. I am cautiously optimistic that the initial difficulties of bringing creditors with very different perspective together are being sorted out. The Paris Club, together with the non-Paris Club creditors like China, India, Saudi Arabia, as well as private sector participants. In the case of Chad, for example, Glencore was the most important creditor. They are coming to a common view and a resolution slowly, with a great deal of pressure on the countries that are asking for it. But we need to get delivery. How does the fund approach it? We provide all the technical analysis on debt sustainability. And we run simulations for the creditor committee. If you choose this, you would achieve that. So they can come together and make a decision. And now we are creating a new space for discussion on debt, global sovereign debt roundtable, that would have permanent members at the most senior level, ministers of finance, central bank governors where they're relevant, from the creditors and from debtor countries. And at that roundtable, the private sector would also participate, because what we find ourselves today in a situation in which there is simply no space where this discussion takes place, that everybody who should be around the table is there. So in the next weeks, we will create this space, and not to substitute for the common framework, but to provide resolution on some of the issues, thorny issues that are seen differently by different creditors. For those, I have read so many commentaries saying, oh, the common framework hasn't delivered anything. One, not true, because it has delivered Chad, and I'm very hopeful we will see Zambia next. But we need to remember that all the debt resolution processes in the past took time. We need to remember that the Brady bonds took 8 years. HIPIC took 10 years. Even the Paris Club took decades to become what it is today. And frankly, I'm asking those who say, oh, it hasn't delivered, what is the alternative? So we say, doesn't work, let's just scrap it. Then what? Then everybody goes in bilateral negotiations, and it is a complete mess. Who is going to suffer? It's going to be the debtor countries. So the more we force a resolution that is in multilateral setting, based on objective analysis that staff of the IMF and the World Bank do, the better chances we have that interests of all the creditors and the debtors will be well served. I also ask those who say, but the creditors, they should agree immediately. Simple question. If you provide me with a loan, in good faith, expecting that I will pay you back, and I come and I say, so sorry, I really can't, wouldn't you want to negotiate a fair resolution? Of course you would. So we have to be a bit more objective, that these are complicated matters, and make sure that not speed but quality is the predominant consideration. We could end negotiations faster, but to the detriment of the country, because usually, the creditors understandably have a common interest. I want my money back. So they can easily gang on the debtor. So how we get a fair resolution does require prudent work, and it does require time. I'm saying all this fully aware that we are in a difficult moment. We don't see a systemic debt crisis, global debt crisis. We don't see that at this point. But we do see the risk of countries, one after another, falling off the debt cliff and then having a lost decade, very hard time to climb up. And we have to prevent that. Plus, we have to prevent the lack of resolution of cases under consideration to lead to other countries that need that resolution to just stay away, not to ask for that treatment. So thank you, Mr. Silla, for reminding me that there was a question on that. And actually, I think it is, for us at the fund, one of the top-of-mind questions because of the trend in interest rates and the impact it has on our members. Thank you.
Thank you, MD. I'm looking at the program. I think we are now moving to the summing up and the concluding remarks by the Deputy Governor of Central Bank of Burundi. The floor is yours, Governor.
Merci encore une fois, Excellence, Monsieur le ministre des Finances. Je voudrais, au nom des pays invités, vous remercier infiniment pour nous avoir conviés à cette importante réunion. Nous voudrions aussi remercier le Fonds monétaire international pour cet instrument du Trust Fund qui va aider nos pays à faire face au changement climatique. Nous avons compris que ce Trust Fund est une combinaison d'autres programmes macroéconomiques qu'on a avec le Fonds monétaire et nous allons y travailler pour que cet instrument puisse être bénéfique pour tous nos pays. Nous avons compris qu'il y a beaucoup de défis, notamment d'accès, qu'il y a des réformes à faire et nous allons formuler notre requête pour pouvoir bénéficier de ce Trust Fund et nous avons compris que le Fonds monétaire est disposé à renforcer nos capacités en la matière. Nous avons aussi compris qu'il faudrait nous inspirer de l'exemple du Rwanda pour pouvoir mobiliser ces ressources, mais aussi faire à ce qu'il y ait une coordination de nos partenaires en termes de financement mobilisés pour l'atténuation des effets climatiques. Je voudrais encore une fois remercier le Fonds monétaire pour les différentes initiatives qui sont prises pour notre région. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much for for your closing, for summing up and closing remarks. Now we are going to enter into a session for the Q&A, and this will be an open conversation. If you have any question, you can raise up your hand. You can introduce who you are and who you're addressing your question to. This is open to the participants in the room. We can start taking questions. Yes. Introduce your name and
Merci. Je voudrais m'exprimer en français. Je m'appelle Gérard Rugambwa. Je suis un journaliste du journal en ligne Le Canapé. Ma question s'adresse à la directrice du Fonds monétaire international. Madame la directrice, au-delà de l'aide financière, que peut faire le Fonds monétaire international pour soutenir les pays africains qui ont déjà des économies engagées sur la voie de la résilience climatique? Et en plus de cela, comment profiter de votre appui? Profiter judicieusement. Merci.
thank you for your question.
Good afternoon, Kristalina, Honorable Managing Director. First, I wanted to say it's a really wonderful opportunity to have you here in Rwanda. The last time we spent time together, we were in Indonesia together. You were with the World Bank at that time, and we were showing you the impact of our projects in Bali as you were there for the annual meeting. So it's wonderful to have you here again as well. I wanted to address or touch on, make a comment on some of the issues that you raised, but also to respond, I believe it is, to the governor of the Central Bank of Uganda, who spoke a little bit about this diagnostic work. In terms of collaboration, I think you're right, we can always do better, but I'm actually quite proud of the way that we have been collaborating here, the IMF and World Bank, and the coordination with other development partners, particularly around the agenda of climate resilience. As you mentioned, we worked together very closely and in a very short amount of time to respond, to ensure that there was a strong package for the RST. And one of the reasons why that was facilitated was that Rwanda was one of the very first countries who completed the Country Climate and Development Report, one of the first 23 countries in the world. This is a World Bank report, a new report that was put in place last year that essentially looks at climate resilience and what it is that countries can do in order to do better and more, and specifically at the macro implications of that. And so, Honorable Governor, I would want to say to you that I have been in touch with the country manager of the World Bank in Uganda, and she has said that they have already started preparing the Country Climate and Development Report for Uganda. And so you too will have your diagnostic ready when you are able to apply to the RST. My understanding is that it should be delivered next year. It's a comprehensive report that touches across many different sectors. It is led by a combination of experts that look at, in the case of Rwanda, we looked at water, we looked at private sector, we looked at macro. So it takes a little bit of time, but the preparations are in place for Uganda to have a similar report completed, and will therefore put you in line to be able to make your application for similar resources from the IMF. Wanted also then to touch on the point of capacity building. This is something that the bank has been in place and been doing for quite a while, and particularly on the climate agenda, looking at regulatory and legal background, looking as well at the NDCs. We were definitely partners with Rwanda in the preparation of the NDCs that was submitted in May 2020. And so I can definitely say on behalf of the bank that we are available for that, for the countries who need that support. We're very excited to hear from the distinguished delegate of Kenya, the work on FLOCA, which was a lot of hard, heavy lifting, but I think it will yield great benefits. I think the very last point that I'd want to touch on, Kristalina, is on the catalytic nature of the financing. We too at the bank have been very focused on trying. I agree with you wholeheartedly that there's clearly not sufficient public resources to be able to address this massive, tremendous challenge that the globe is facing. And so we always try to ensure that the resources that are used are essentially able to catalyze additional resources, particularly resources from the private sector. And this has very much been the case. Last year, we spent over, I think, $32 billion was the bank's contribution to climate finance last year, $27 billion the year before. And I think one of the best examples for me of catalyzing, and where I'm quite proud, is the very small trust fund that we use to help the government of Rwanda to contribute to the establishment of the Ireme Invest, which then at the COP was able to raise over $104 million in climate finance for Rwanda. It means that we know how to do this. We are happy to do this and willing to do this with all of our partners. And we very much appreciate the alignment, the support, the encouragement of the working together with the IMF. We very much appreciate the initiative of the RST and look forward to partnering in future excellent, innovative work. I thank you. But my name, by the way, Roland Price, by country manager for the World Bank.
Thank you, Roland. Edmond Kajire.
Thank you very much. My name is Edmund Kajira. I work for Keti Press. I'm a journalist. Rwanda is one of the countries that have been able to access the RST along with Costa Rica and Barbados. And from the questions we had from the officials from the EAC countries here, access to the fund is needed sooner than later. You mentioned something about the resources not being enough, but I would like to ask, what will it take to bring more countries on board, especially from Africa, given the real and severe challenge of climate change they face today? Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. I would like to take the last question. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Mugaga. I work with the Ministry of Finance in Uganda, and I'm in charge of climate finance. Just a reminder of the question that the minister raised about twinning the beneficiary countries and the developed countries that have these dormant SDR. I think you missed it, so maybe you can answer that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll answer those questions now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to start with the last question because I did miss answering it. SDR, special drawing rights, are a reserve asset, meaning that their nature as reserve assets need to be protected. To be protected, there is a preference on the side of the holders of this asset to bring their resources together so the IMF can minimize the risk of a loss on that basis. This being said, it is possible for a bilateral arrangement in which a country that holds SDRs agrees with another country to lend to this country a portion of its own SDRs. This is possible. What we see is that for European SDR holders, the European Central Bank only allows use of SDRs to on-lend through the IMF. Very narrow provision. Why? Because they say, we want to be sure you're not going to lose it. We count on us as a collective to have certain level of reserves, and we want to be sure yours are protected. But other countries, for example, the UK, or China is a big contributor to the RST, they might think of bilateral arrangements, and we will respect this arrangement. We at the IMF would facilitate the technicality of a transaction. When you receive SDRs, then there is an interest rate on the SDRs that needs to be served. But of course, it is much lower than anything else that is out there. So let me go back to the first question. What do we do beyond financial assistance through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust? What we do, probably the most important contribution we do very often jointly with the World Bank, is to provide the macro financial framework for addressing climate issues. In other words, what I described as including climate in Article 4 consultations. Article 4, for those who may not know it, this is an annual engagement. The fund has, with some countries, biannual, in which we take the pulse of the national economy and we identify where there could be space for improvements in policies. We also are providing global service, again, in many cases, together with the World Bank, on data, because you can only make good decisions if you have reliable data. And we are looking for ways to innovate, to come up with products that weren't there before, but we are adding them. I am very hopeful that we would find a way for carbon offsets to become a fiscal tool that is available to low-income countries. Of course, we lend beyond the RST, and as we learn more through our engagement with Article 4 about the interface between macro policies and climate, then our traditional programs will be better informed to support agricultural resilience, agricultural productivity, support private sector, removing barriers for private sector engagement. I am very pleased that Ms. Price is here with us. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you looking at the, but I would say, here is the bank in its best. We talk about green, and she's dressed in green. As I said in the beginning, we would have not been able to move that quickly with Rwanda if we didn't have the country climate and development report from the World Bank. And that applies to other countries. The more we have high-quality diagnostics done, the faster we can move to provide support to the country. And I would urge countries where there is interest in this particular instrument of the World Bank, tap into it. I also very much agree that capacity development is something that we all have a duty to provide in our area of expertise. The bank has much broader, deeper, and comprehensive expertise when it comes to climate change. At the fund, we know fiscal, we know monetary policy, we know how to integrate those in what is being done. As Ms. Price mentioned, I worked at the bank. I love the institution. I think it is a fantastic service provider to its membership. Actually, I'm by training an environmental economist, so I spent a big chunk of my professional life leading the environmental work of the World Bank. And I can vouch for the incredible capacity of the bank to innovate, to come up with solutions to problems that are genuinely new. And of course, we are very keenly interested to work very closely with the bank. I do want to still flag that we all have a duty to work even closer together. Because of that dilemma we face, needs going up, funding at best staying flat. The World Bank is now thinking, well, maybe they can do more on the climate agendas if they get more capital from their members. So I would encourage all the ministers here, do support capital increase for the World Bank, for the African Development Bank, and do support more subsidy resources for the IMF so we can do more for the countries that need this help the most. On the question of how we can move faster for Africa, the best way to achieve it is to look for collaboration that would give us this quality diagnostics that can build on the basis of which we can build a program. We do policies, we don't do investments. We look at how the policy environment can benefit the country, and we don't want to pretend we know if we don't. So this work, a credible diagnostics work done by other institutions like the World Bank, and also some of our own macro analysis, this is what would make it possible for us to move faster. One thing we learned during the pandemic, what did we find? That people with strong immune systems were less likely to get sick, and if they get sick, much less likely to die. The same applies to countries. Countries with strong fundamentals, during the pandemic, they were more resilient to the shock it caused. So I want to finish with this message that we have to We have to, yes, we have to have economic vaccine. Good policies are the vaccines for our economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Madam MD. We have come to the end of our session. Thank you very much, Honorable Madam MD, Honorable Ministers, State Ministers, Governors, and Deputy Governors. Allow me to invite you for a family picture outside of this room. Our protocol will guide us into the session. Thank you so much.
And after the photo session?
After the photo session, we'll have lunch. Lunch will be in the auditorium club, and protocol will guide us again in that session. Thank you.